So I'm really excited about our afternoon session here today. We've been talking about some really fascinating issues. So I think part of what we're going to try to do here in the afternoon is do some kind of cross-pollination, cross-fertilization. And so it's really my honor to be part of this panel. Two giants in the field. And so what I'm going to do is introduce them one at a time. They're going to each talk for about 10-ish minutes. And then we're going to save questions to the end. And I've been asked to, on late notice, sort of provide some kind of comments also, so I'll do that. And then we'll open up for questions and comments. All right, so let's, I don't know what the order is. You guys have a preference on the order? Okay. All right, so Neeraj Kaushal is professor of social policy and chair of the doctoral program at Columbia University, School of Social Work, and research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She is also research fellow at IZA, the Institute for the Study of Labor in Germany, and her work is broadly on sort of immigration and welfare. Neeraj, yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Is it on?
Oops. Oh, I'm so sorry.
I got it. Put it in your pocket. Check it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my forthcoming book, and I'll talk about two different things. One is I look at U.S. immigration from an international perspective. Immigration is a hot button issue. We know that it's changing electoral politics all over the world, not just in Europe or United States, but even in many Asian countries. In my book, I actually look at what are the causes of why is the emergence of far-right parties all over the world. They seem to be blaming immigration for many of the core problems that these countries are facing. And I ask this question, is it immigration or is it something else? I look at 7 what I believe to be core causes of core problems that many Western democracies are facing, and see whether immigration is the cause or is one of the factors that is impacting these causes. I look at identity and nationalism, demographic changes in Western countries, stagnation of productivity, increasing inequality, rise of refugee movements, and international terrorism. And for each of these causes, I look at how is immigration contributing, how is immigration impacting them. And what I find is that immigration is neither the cause, the pace or volume of immigration is not the fundamental cause of these the problems that many Western economies are facing. And I conclude that it's probably the ability of these nations to manage immigration and the appetite of nations to accept or absorb immigration that is perhaps causing so much discontent and disaffection towards immigration. If you want me to talk a little more on that, I can do that in the question answer session. I want to talk a little bit about what I have about US immigration in my book. Now, on US immigration, whether you're a leftist or a rightist, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're pro-immigration or you're against immigration, I think one thing that most people agree on is that US immigration system is broken. We all agree on that. The last 3 presidents, even the current president, would say that yes, the US, they have multiple times said that the US immigration system is broken. And I also, at least a few years ago, believed in that. What impacted, I'll tell you a small story, but that impacted my thinking of immigration, US immigration system. 5 years ago, I was visited by a delegation of 25 people from the Chinese Communist Party. And they visited me in New York. They asked me to share my views on US immigration system. I later learned that these people had actually gone around the country. They had met with lawyers, they met with administrators, they met with immigrant groups to learn about the US immigration system as they were trying to design their own immigration system. In 2013, China came out with its first entry and exit policy on immigration. So my presentation for this group, I started my usual PowerPoint presentation where I started building a case towards the US immigration system being broken. So I was slowly, counting one problem after another, and the head of the delegation got exasperated with me. So in the middle, he just got up and he said, if, as you say that the US immigration system is broken, how come the United States attracts the most number of immigrants in the world than any other country in the world? A fifth of all immigrants in the world come to the United States. A fifth of all international students come to the United States. He said, how come, if the US immigration system is broken, that the US is able to bring people who create industries? These are people who invent drugs. These are people who create employment opportunities for Americans. And then finally he said, how come, if the US immigration system is broken, that the United States is able to assimilate immigrants better than Canada? So that changed our conversation in the room. I threw my PowerPoint away because I couldn't really continue. And our conversation changed from the US system being broken, or what is broken in the system, to what is working in the US immigration system. Next 5 years, I started looking at immigration in a very different light. I started doing research to learn more about what is working in the US immigration system. And I developed a far more nuanced view of US immigration. Even something that I didn't expect I would say or do, I came to the conclusion that the US immigration system on many aspects is probably the best in the world. I know you weren't expecting me to say that. I didn't think that I would say that either, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge it by, especially for those who are for immigration and even for those who are against it, by calling immigration system as broken, US immigration system as broken, we seem to be blaming immigrants for it. We seem to be blaming that immigrants are the cause of all this problem. So I was talking about my, other countries where immigration is becoming a major issue. There's a huge disaffection towards immigration. And because it's happening in every country, the narrative is that US immigration system must be broken. I'm sorry, the narrative is that the problem is with immigrants. That it's happening everywhere, it has to be immigrants who are the cause of the problem. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there are parts of US immigration system that countries around the world look at with a very envious way. There are parts of US immigration system which I found through my research that other countries have tried to replicate, including Canada, Germany, UK, and even China. China has, can you imagine? They have a China green card in Beijing and Shanghai. Germany started a few years ago a green card, which was actually US's H-1B visa system. So there are parts of US immigration system that are the envy of the world, that have done very well, that other countries are replicating. But there are also parts of the US immigration system that is broken, that needs mending. Do I have time to talk?
Time, yes.
Okay, so I'll take 3-4 minutes about I think there are 5 major aspects of US immigration system which I believe are broken. The first aspect is, I think everybody kind of agrees with that, which is that we have about 10 to 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. They are finding it more and more difficult to legalize. Increasingly, the chances of deportation are increasing for this population. Now the problem is that many of these families have, these people have siblings who are US born. they have siblings or they have children who are US born or you're US residents. So breaking them, their deportation would be breaking families. And let's just remind ourselves that the current US immigration system, which is based on the 1965 law, the guiding principle of that law was reunification of families. So, what we saw recently at the border, separating families from children from their families, is just completely flouting that guiding principle that we thought we followed for all these decades. Now, that's one of the biggest problem. I think the second big problem we have in our immigration system is that while we have a number of channels for immigration of or entry of people in professional occupations or people who are highly educated, we don't have similar channels for the entry of people in other occupations. And I believe, and I think most economists agree, that the United States needs people in all occupation and skill categories. We need people, and our demographics are such that we need people across various spectrum of skills and occupations. And because we don't provide any legal entry, one of the causes of increase in undocumented immigration is this. The third broken part of our system is that, as I said, we have a number of categories, visa categories for the entry of skilled professional people, but we do not have sufficient number of avenues for their permanent residence here. As a result, many people who come here as students get high education at universities like Duke universities or all over the countries. We have many good universities in this country. They work here for a few years, they get all this skill from here, and after that they find there's no option for them to stay here anymore unless they become undocumented, and they leave. When they leave, they take with them their US born children, So this is another phenomena. In the last few years we've seen outflow of many skilled people who've got an education from here. We've heard people like Bill Gates and other people saying that, well, these people, students, should be given green card as they graduate from American university. But we are nowhere near that. The current administration is talking about have different plans for this, for H-1B visa and other visas. I think the fourth problem with our immigration system is that there's a huge backlog. Our administrative capacity of dealing with cases is very, very poor. As a result of which we have 4.4 million, according to the US state administration of numbers, that we have 4.4 million pending green card applications outside of the United States and about 1 million pending within the United States. So we have a huge backlog, and we don't nearly have the administrative capacity to deal with them. A similar problem arises with our judicial system for asylum seekers, that we nearly don't have the capacity to deal with them, as a result of which many asylum seekers, they deal with their cases as they are in detention. And I think the last point I will make is about what many people call that our porous border with Mexico. Now, this is a geographic reality. We have one of the longest border with a country that has relatively much low income. As a result, we receive a lot of, or we used to receive a lot of Mexican immigrants, or we receive many undocumented immigrants from that border. Now, I don't have any problem with this geographic reality. My problem is the way we have handled it by spending a lot of money year after year on border enforcement. So there was a recent study that did the numbers for 2012, and they found that we annually in that year spent $18 billion, which was more on border enforcement, which is more than the money that we spend on all law enforcement. Now, this is the way we are spending this money. We still have not been able to define the metric of success for border enforcement. The metric of success through successive administrations is that more money. The amount of money that's being spent is the metric of success. So if that is your metric of success, the only thing you're going to do is spend more and more money instead of defining what would be a successful uh, border enforcement policy. Now, as I said, about 63 years ago, when we had 53 years ago, when we had our 1965 policy, family reunification was the primary goal of immigration. Now, national security has become the primary goal of immigration policy. And I don't have any problem with that goal. I think the problem is with not defining what is the metric of success for that policy. And lacking that, we have reached a situation where we have this borderline madness, where we don't know what should be our goal, what are we going to call as the successful policy, but we keep on spending more and more money, and we keep on increasing enforcement. So I think that is a major problem. We need to rethink about it as to what do we want to achieve with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. All right, and now we have Clarence Lusane, who's professor of international relations and chairperson of the political science department at Howard University. He's been both an activist and a scholar, and is well respected in the areas of human rights, African American politics, global relations, U.S. Elections, and international relations. Today he's going to talk to us a little bit about, broadly speaking, sort of race in France.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
First, let me begin by thanking Dr. Darity and the Samuel DuBois Cook Center for pulling this conference together. These are really cutting-edge issues, and it's really, really critical to have these kind of gatherings and these kinds of exchanges. Dr. Darity, Sandy reminded me when he contacted me about coming to the conference that he and I had wrote articles together for the State of Black America. This was many years ago. And what was really important about that issue was that it was the first time that the Urban League, which puts out the State of Black America, actually included issues about blackness on an international scale. So that was really kind of a growth that happened not just with the Urban League, but was happening with other black organizations as well. I also want to thank Dr. Jean Beaman for her work. There are many touch points with the work that I do, and it's been an incredible read for me, and I'll talk about this in a minute. And then thanks to all the other presenters for your insights and your research. This is really a collective understanding that's been unfolding. But let me begin with a story. So a number of years ago, I was in Sarajevo in Bosnia. I used to do a lot of work with Roma communities, and I was there for some meetings. So I decided at one point that I would go to the spot where Archduke Ferdinand had been assassinated in June 1914 that led to World War I. He had been assassinated right next to a bridge. There's a river, a small river that runs through the city, and there are bridges that take people back and forth. And it's really a small river. The size of the river is like from here to that wall. And so I go there, and it's a little weird because they actually have on the ground footprints where the assassin stood when he shot the Archduke. It's kind of creepy, but people go. So I went to this spot, and I'm standing there, and I look up, and on the other side of the bridge, I see this black man. And it looks like he's with his family, and I assume he's a local guy because he's dressed in local clothing. He sees me, and he starts waving. But before I could wave at him, shortly behind him, there's a white American family. And the father in the family, I'm guessing they're Americans because the guy has on a flag, T-shirt, and all that. So he's waving at me. So I'm trying to figure who should I wave at, right? My homie over here or my other homie over here, right? So they're waving, so I just kind of do a general wave both of them. But what it underlined was this thing that W.B. Du Bois talked about, this two-ness, these identities that we carry with us regardless of where we go. And although we may try to escape them, they're structured in many ways. And so that was really kind of insightful for me in just sort of looking at how these moments kind of come up. Just to give a little bit about my own background, a lot of my work has been on looking at race, ethnicity, and human rights issues in Europe, particularly through work I've done looking at the experience of people of African descent during the Nazi era, and then work I did in Western Union working with the European Union. And I lived in the UK for a number of years, particularly going back to 2001. I moved to England in early August 2001. In late August, I went to Durban, South Africa for the World Conference Against Racism. And then after that was over, came back to the UK on September 9th, and then September 11th happened. And that completely overthrew what we had been trying to do in Durban in addressing issues of Islamophobia, racism, discrimination. And for the next 2.5 years or so, most of the time I was in England and in Europe. So my vantage point on what happened around 2011, September 11th, was from the outside, not from the inside. Now, I talked to people in Washington, and they talked about the barriers that were going up and just kind of the hysteria. But it was a very different kind of discourse that was unfolding in the UK and in Europe. And I want to sort of start to try to connect some of this. Okay, so going back.
That's the wrong one.
That's the wrong one? Okay, going back. All right, so I want to go back to 1973. In 1973, the UK joined what was then the European Economic Community. And this was a decisive moment. Later, a couple of other countries joined, and it later became not the European, it changed to the European Union. And this is important because once it became the European Union, it not only focused on economic issues, but it also focused on social questions as well. And there's not a lot of attention that's given to the power of the EU to drive these social issues and to change these narratives and policies in a lot of countries, but that was really critical. And so 1973 was seen as a period when Europe was going to unite, it was going to get past the different languages, the different cultures, and it was going to move forward in a united kind of way. But 1973 was also important because of this book, The Camp of the Saints. This was a book that was written by a French novelist named Jean Respire, and a very well-known novelist, and you can tell from this subtitle up here, a chilling novel about the end of the white world. So this is a very, very, very dark novel. And what it says, what the story is about, is how Europe eventually is overrun. First by these refugees from India, but then from Africa and other parts of the world. And the book describes in just stark, horrifying details the kind of brutalities, the rapes, all of the things that are done to whites in Europe, eventually taking over the region. But not only Europe, because eventually this swarm takes over the United States, takes over Australia, takes over Canada, takes over New Zealand, takes over all of the countries. The last country is Switzerland, and it hangs in there for a while, but then eventually Switzerland is taken over as well. So this is some really, really kind of deep in the mud stuff that developed. And this book, of course, is at the kind of extreme end. It sold about 500,000 copies by the beginning of the 21st century, but essentially was basically off to the side there. But it's received a revival because of Steve Bannon. Now, Steve Bannon said during the campaign, once Trump was elected, and has said ever since then, this is his favorite novel. He is quoted from it numerous times. He's talked about it in ways in which he saw it as a guide for policy. Steve Miller, Jeff Sessions, Kelly have all basically talked about this book, right? So Steve Bannon has decided that this is the model for sparking the movement in Europe around coming together on these issues of immigration. And Bannon, since he was dismissed from the White House, although he stayed in touch with Trump, has been traveling in Europe creating what he calls the movement, which is to try to bring all of these forces together. And so he's been at a lot of these meetings and gatherings. Now, as Trump was running for office, the far right in Europe began to meet and began to come together, both in support of Trump and trying to figure out ways to make links with the Trump campaign and then eventually with the Trump administration. Now, Trump did not create these organizations, but he has become a symbol for them of getting power. And in every instance, they've come together around make Europe great again. Now, Bannon spoke at the National Front Party Congress earlier this year. He's been speaking at a lot of these different events. They've invited him to be part of it. At this conference, he said, let them call you racist, let them call you xenophobes, let them call you nativists. Wear it as a badge of courage. So it isn't just kind of a theory with Bannon and Trump and these forces, but they're actually in mobilization. So this work, the Camp of Saints, wasn't just hate speech, but it was actually a mobilizer and an incitement kind of document. Now, I talk about this because there are a lot of takeaways from Dr. Beaman's book. There are a lot of points where she's hitting a lot of the issues and things that I've been concerned with, but there are two that I want to talk about very quickly. One, she says, quote, the construction of race and ethnicity occurs simultaneously with the construction of the nation. A second point she raises, racial and ethnic underpinnings of French republicanism disallow even successful children of immigrants to ever truly be viewed as French by the others. So what's really critical for me is looking at what framed ideologically the development of Europe around these issues. There's a quote from French philosopher Francois Bernier. There are 4 or 5 species or races of men in particular whose difference is so remarkable that it may properly be made use of as the foundation for a new division of the earth. Now, this is unambiguous. This is not kind of waffling. This is a very clear perspective on how the earth should be organized, and people on the earth. From Arthur G. Gobineau, who I may be mispronouncing, who Dr. Beaman refers to in her book. Sorry, I spelled her name wrong. He says, for a large number of human beings, it has been and will always be impossible to even take the first step towards civilization. And the last quote would be from Hegel, who wrote, Negroes are to be regarded as a race of children who remain immersed in their state of universal naivete. They are sold and let themselves be sold without any reflections on the rights or wrongs of the matter. So these are not ideas that have went away. These ideas have been seeded in Europe for many, many decades, and at various moments find expression and find their ways into the political stream, Now, what we're seeing in this period right now, the context in which Dr. Beaman's book has come out, is this effort to unite the right globally. So we all know about the event that happened in Charlottesville, which was sort of to unite the right and the far right and the racists in the United States. But this is going on at a global level. And there have been lots and lots of meetings with these organizations pushing this Unite agenda. From the National Rally Party, the National Front in France changed its name earlier this year, the Brothers of Italy, the League Alternative for Germany, UKIP. Now, these are some of the modernizing far-right forces. So there are some much more extreme groups who do not attempt to play a role in party politics and in electoral politics. But these particular groups, and there are more, have decided that there are paths for them in the national bodies, national assemblies, in local townships, and in European bodies, such as the Council of Europe and the European Union's, the Assembly. And so they have started to become very active in winning seats in these bodies. One of the individuals who's become really close to Trump is Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage was the head of the UK Independent Party, UKIP, and UKIP was instrumental in the passage of Brexit, the decision by UK voters to get out of the European Union, a decision that they're regretting. Right, and now they're in a very big turmoil because come March 29th next year, whether they come up with a plan or not, they're out of the EU. And Theresa May is having many, many sleepless nights because she can't win her own party to a plan that would provide some safeguards. But the EU has been really clear that March 29th, you guys are out the door. We're changing the locks, cutting off the lights. You guys are gone. And so they're in a frantic. But this was led through a lot of anti-immigrant propaganda by UKIP with Farage. And Farage got close to Trump. He was here for Trump's campaign. He spoke at campaign events like in Mississippi, for example. He was here for the night of the election, and he was here for the inauguration. So what we're witnessing is even with conservative presidents, from George H.W. Bush to George Bush to Reagan, they're created a wall between themselves and the far, far right. Now, there were people who helped make some of those bridges, but those bridges are gone with Trump. And there's direct connection with a lot of these forces. Trump, both sort of backdoor as well as kind of upfront relationships. Now, that has created some fretting among the more center-right forces in Europe. So Angela Merkel, Theresa May, Macron, all have tried to create some distance from some of these extreme forces, although their bases overlap to a significant degree. And so they have argued that there are acceptable immigrants because they have seen the data. They have seen the demographics, as my colleague talked about. So they may not want immigrants, but they need immigrants. And they've known this for at least 10, 15 years. So they need to have policies that allow for immigrants to come in massive numbers to Europe if they're going to be competitive economically, if the region's going to be viable. At the same time, though, there's pressure from the other side, from the xenophobes and others who don't care about those numbers and don't have a long view, at least not a long view tied to Europe being competitive. So all of these leaders have, in various ways, say that, yeah, immigration is okay and we need a policy to deal with it and kind of all that. But they've also backed up against the wall. And so they've come out and spoken out against multiculturalism. So Merkel has come out and said, of course, the tendency has been to say, let's adopt multicultural concept and happy side by side and be happy to be living. But this concept has failed and failed utterly. Sarkozy said the same thing, but so have other center-right leaders as they've been unable to convince their base in these conservative constituencies that they should be going in another direction. So this is a really important point that I think Dr. Beaman underscores in her work in looking at these sort of long-term ways in which these arguments are happening. Okay, so what about the Obama effect? Now, this is actually a poster from last year when there was a little small movement in France to try to get Obama to run for president of France. Didn't go far, right? But what about the Obama effect? And what did it mean for Obama, who's second generation? He's a second generation individual. Now, that has been erased to a great degree in discourses in the Black community because he was just seen as a brother, right? But there were those in 2007, 2008, as Obama talked about running, there was a small discourse in the Black community about he's not Black, right? He didn't grow up around Black people. He grew up in Hawaii. Like, what is that, right? So people were kind of dissing him, but most Black people were like, yeah, he kind of like looked like us, so, you know, he's one of us. So Obama was basically appropriated to the Black community. But Obama, right, so what was the impact? Because for a lot of leaders, European leaders, Obama was seen as this success. He was seen as this model, right, that he could be a token for how second generation immigrants in these countries could move forward and what the state could do about it. And on the one hand, there were many people of color, immigrants of color, who had become citizens or were born in these countries who were inspired by Obama to run for office. There's one area of research I've been doing just looking at that. So in Germany, the UK, Russia, Slovakia, and Italy, and in the United States, this year has the largest number of non-African American people of African descent running for office in the history of the country. People of Caribbean and African descent. All over the country, running for mayors, running for city councils, running for Congress. And a bunch of them are gonna win. And so there are gonna be a lot of breakthroughs in the election that's coming up in next week just on this issue, right? And when Obama became president, everybody from the leaders in Germany and the UK and other places was saying, we've got to find our own Obama, right? This is like a great thing, and this would be like great for bringing the country together. On the other hand, there was a backlash. So in the United States, this meant the Tea Party, and ultimately it meant Donald Trump. In fact, I would argue the idea of successful second generations probably generates more hatred than the other way around. Because these are seen in zero-sum kind of politics as that success takes from mine. And Obama was seen in stark terms. And I would venture that in many ways, when we talk about, as Dr. Beaman shows, those who have become doctors and lawyers and professionals and run small businesses, that is actually generating resentment because it's not challenged, and it actually feeds into this narrative of why are they successful and I'm not? What are they getting that I'm not getting? All right.
You want to try to wrap it up?
I am. All right. And so there's lots going on in Europe. This is basically, and particularly in France. Let me end here. A couple of things, where do we go? First of all, there has to be a revolution in ideology around these belief systems because this is the well from which these right-wing forces draw as they make these arguments. And that has to be challenged in a number of different ways. The role of the state is really critical in generating these policies and laws that constrain. They're not going to get rid of, but they can constrain racial discrimination, xenophobia, Islamophobia, this hyper-nationalism. Civil society has to be permanently and persistently engaged and involved. And then lastly, counter-narratives to this dominant neoliberal tropes of diversity and inclusion, such as Dr. Beaman's Citizens Outsider, are essential. All right, thank you.
All right, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk for maybe 5 minutes, and then what I want you folks to be doing while I'm talking is paying less attention to me and trying to think about the kinds of questions that you might have, because I really want to engage in a conversation. So my thinking, what I'm going to try to do here today is try to bring the books that were at the core of the presentation of the afternoon, the morning, into conversation with one another, right? So one of the things that I think one of my intellectual great-grandfather or grandfather, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, often sort of argues is that you can't talk about race unless you talk about white supremacy, right? And so one thing I would just also add is that we can't have these conversations without some type of conversation around colonialism, right? And I think that one way in which we can make sense of the tensions that are present in the books that we've been chartered to read for today is an understanding of colonialism and white supremacy and how that prefigures ethno-racial population success or not success in a given country. And so what I mean by that is what we've been asked to do is take a case of North Africans living in France who are generally socioeconomically mobile. They are investing in education. They are, as Dr. Beaman often says, sort of checking all the boxes to become French. And yet we don't see the kind of model minority Asian American success story there, right? We do see the behaviors, the cultural repertoire, the values, right? The behaviors, the attitudes that we might imagine would lead to greater success in any given country. But we don't see the success. On the other hand, in the United States, we see a story of greater Asian American achievement, and we are encouraged to think about this as in part a product of kind of the value for success, right? That in fact, a large part of the reason why Asian Americans do well in the United States is because they have a certain kind of value for hard work, right? And so part of what I'm going to say about colonialism here is I think it's the colonialism thing that helps us make sense of this inconsistency, right? On the one hand, we see cultural values and effort not leading to success in a given country. In another place, we want to attribute success to cultural values and attitudes. And so one might speculate, and I hope this is provocative enough to get some people ready to have a conversation. I would promote the idea or offer you that the story here is about colonialism. The story here is that black folks who are living in France are former colonial subjects, and therefore there is a certain kind of orientation to having subjects living below, if you will, a sort of caste line, who are now coming back and trying to sort of be part of the club, right? On the other hand, while America's had a range of sort of foreign policy interventions in Asia, we've never had an Asian colony per se. We do have, and I am not a specialist in Asian American studies, but I would argue that certainly the United States has never been in control of affairs in China, for example. And so therefore, these populations are, if you will, allowed to succeed, right? So and there's some, I think, interesting examples around low achieving, not very hardworking Asian Americans being selected into AP courses, right? As part of Minzu's book, right? And so how do we make sense of that? If it's about hard work and this person doesn't have what it takes, how'd they end up in AP? And I would tell you that's a story about allowances. I would tell you that's a story about Asian Americans being incorporated in the United States above the caste line. given the lack of a history of sort of a colonial period. Now, part of the reason why it's hard for us to see the connections between this, I would argue, is because they're happening in two different countries, right? So we think that France is sort of wholly different in many, many ways than the United States. And so, it's hard for us to make comparatives. And so I'm going to offer to you some of my work on comparing African Americans and black immigrants as a way to sort of net out the effects of between country differences to make sense of this kind of colonialism argument that I'm making. So as many of you will know, black immigrants in the United States tend to do better than African Americans, and a lot of people have tried to make good sense of that. I would say they've tried and failed largely. And I think I have some work that would be compelling to push you to believe that too. My own suspicion is that the context of reception is wholly different for African Americans and black immigrants, maybe not wholly, but different, and that a lot of this has to do with, again, the colonial situation, right? So what is the colonial situation? America has never had an African colony, so to speak, right? And yet African Americans are subjugated in the American colonial history, right? Vis-a-vis slavery, et cetera. And so because these bodies, while they both share sort of a multivariate distribution of hair texture, skin color, bone structure, maybe even genetic ancestry if you want to take it there, right? They share these factors. They are thought of very differently in the United States. And this is what we have, sort of the black immigrant model minority myth and trope. And so I can show you in some pretty interesting studies that when black immigrants are working for white managers, their soft skills, hard skills, their racial attitudes, they make more money than when they're not working for white managers. And yet African Americans don't make any more money either way, right? So I'm arguing that there are distinctions being made and there's favoritism toward black immigrants, net, skin color, et cetera, right? And that this favoritism is largely motivated by this lack of a colonial situation vis-a-vis the black immigrants. Again, I think that as we have this conversation sort of backing out, right, thinking about the American empire, thinking about the sort of rise and fall of Europe, how much of this is really about global colonialism and its struggle to remain relevant in the United States, and different strategy in the world, and different strategies that are being taken to maintain global subjugation vis-a-vis the Europeans. All right, and so with that, let's open it up for questions.
Hi, I have two questions, one for Clarence Lusane and one for Mosi. The first question for Clarence is, you started your presentation saying that when you were giving the presentation to the Chinese, had a great impact on how you saw immigration. I was wondering if you could clarify how your definition of a working immigration system has changed from that point to now. And if you could define it in terms of the immigrant versus the country that receives the immigrant. That's one question. And then for Mosi, I wanted to ask, I want to ask you, how do you think your perspective about colonialism applies to Mexico?
Just broadly, just in any particular, what do you mean?
Well, because
U.S.
Mexico,
relations vis-a-vis Mexico, or
yeah, because most of the undocumented immigrants obviously are from Mexico, but technically the U.S. never colonized Mexico.
That's provocative. Clarence.
No, I think her question was actually.
Okay.
So you're right that a lot has changed since I met with the Chinese delegation, which was in 2013, and now. Immigration, even though major policies have not changed, the way they are implemented and the whole environment for immigrants has been vitiated. As a result of which, especially for undocumented or those who have undocumented family members, things are becoming increasingly difficult. For other groups such as international students, I have several of them, they are now nervous about whether they'll be able to do their OPT. So things have changed in the United States without there being any major policy changes. But more, I think, has been the vitiated atmosphere because of the implementation of policy rather than from any specific change in policy. Does that answer your question?
All right, so I mean, I would just sort of take issue with the premise of the question, right? So a quick review of American history would reveal a point at which all of California and Texas were Mexico, right? And so I guess the shortest way I can answer that question is to say that I do believe that there's a certain kind of colonial disposition vis-a-vis Mexico and Mexicans. And I think that makes itself evident through the popular terminology that we use to describe Mexicans. So part of this sort of book I'm working on, part of the idea here is that originally, so in the 1300s, 1400s in Europe, there's a lot of population identification and stratification going on. But the markers that are used for it are broadly around religion, language, and nationality. As Europeans sort of go out into the world, they start off with this really interesting distinction between Christian and heathen. With the rise of the Enlightenment, et cetera, that distinction remains the same. The meanings that are associated with what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a heathen, remain the same, but the terminology is slightly revised, right, to civil versus savage, right? And so I would argue that all the populations that occupied the lower caste of colonial systems are all considered to be savages or people that are out of the wild. And so all of the things that all of the stereotypes that we have for colonial populations, if you will, lower caste populations, are derived from this notion of savage. And so the perspective that I would sort of argue for here is that the notion that folks whose lineage used to run the land is somehow illegal in the land, I think shows us the colonial orientation to Mexicans and Mexico, so to, in that way. That'd be my attempt, yeah.
Can I make a comment on?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, okay. So I think part of what you're saying is, it's maybe an extended extension of what you're saying is the disaffection towards immigrants across the world, across the Western world, is partly because of the emergence of many emerging economies that where the engine of growth seems to have moved. So, China is doing very well. Many Asian economies are doing very well, as a result of which many of the, Fortune 500 companies are actually Asian companies. And so the focus of economic growth has changed, and that might it's not colonialism, but it's actually a shift in the focus. But to come to the point of colonialism, I think I just want to say Brexit was not caused by colonialism. Polish and Romanian immigrants were actually not even discriminated because they were of a different color or even or of a different religion. So there's something else going on around the world. And another example of, I do agree with you about colonial Indians and Pakistanis in the UK. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a lot of discrimination against them, and they used to use this word Pakis as a derogatory term to talk about all the South Asian immigrants. But by now, things have changed. Now, if you see, South Asian might be the most successful. Now again, you might ask how you define the term success, and I'm defining it purely as an economic term. They are the most successful economic minority in the UK. So there are, in some parts of the world, colonialism could be a big factor. In some other parts of the world, there are other things which people consider immigrants to be the other. And they think that they seem to be probably, changing the demography of the land, or they're changing we just don't like them, So there may be many other factors that may be creating this disaffection.
Sure. Just real quickly, I would say that colonialism is only. So I sort of opened the introduction from Minzu, talking about the sort of legacy of American sociologists wrestling with questions of race and migration, and I would say that that what we think about as race, or what I would call kind of ethno-raciality, is fundamentally a function of migration, and that's throughout world history, and so. Colonialism is one form of migration, right? So it's one form of a population moving and encountering another population. Another form of migration is what we think about as sort of immigration. And so when new populations enter settled populations, there are ways in which we have historically, for the last 250,000 years, work to make distinctions that we use that there's conflict over, let's say that. And so while European colonialism can't explain everything, colonial migration systems and the conflict that comes from it, I think, is a more general pattern throughout human history. But that I don't know. I'm writing that book now.
Okay.
Minzu, I see you.
I have a question about the role of the civil society, and Clarence alluded this issue at the end of your slide, and then Neeraj had talked about the immigration system in the U.S. being the best, and I agree with that. And also, having lived in different parts of the world, living in Europe and also Singapore, I feel that in the United States, being an immigrant, you fare better in the U.S. than in other countries that I have been to. So the U.S. somehow has a good immigration system, and also have a good integration or assimilation ideology and policy in that regard. But I also feel that the role of the civil society, and also the strengths and the development of the civil society in the United States, from my observation, is far better than in other countries. Could you talk more about the role of the civil society, and also the state of the civil society in other countries that has helped, or more help, has helped immigrants to adapt to society and integrate to the society?
Thanks for that question. Let me weigh in for 1 second on the issue of the Asian community as minority model, because we shouldn't forget that in the history of the U.S., Asian communities have been under attack. We talk about the 19th century, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the policies that existed in states like California were absolutely brutal. And during the era of lynching, there were people of Asian descent who were lynched. And in World War II, it was the Japanese community, Japanese American people of Japanese descent, who were rounded up and put in internment camps. So there's a long kind of harsh history there. And so I think there's a need for kind of really interrogating how does the country move from that to where it's at right now, because it hasn't always been where it's at right now. Civil society is really, really key. When I was working in Europe around the time of the European Union passing what was called the Race Directive, and that was a law basically from the EU that all of the member countries of the EU, all 27 members, had to change their laws and policies to address issues of racial discrimination. They had to have laws on the books. They had to create essentially an office that would kind of deal with it, and there were other things. What was really critical was the degree to which civil society was developed in the different countries to force these states into making that happen. So in the UK, in the Netherlands, a number of these countries, you had a very vibrant, long-time activist civil society around these issues, and so they were better able to kind of push. But in places like Hungary, Spain, Greece, you didn't have that. And people were like, negotiate with who, lobby with who, meet with government people. You know, it just did not have that experience and that history. So that all had to evolve. And a lot of what I was doing was working with these communities that, yeah, you should meet with your people who you elected, right? They should be accountable to you. But this, in many instances, was not a familiar concept, particularly for people who only knew of the state as an opponent. And that, you know, when you talk about the state, you're talking about the police, you're talking about courts, you're talking about immigration, as opposed to your elected officials who should be held accountable, and you should camp out in their office, and you should threaten to run people against them, and, you know, all of those kind of things that you do as engaged civil society. So it's really, really essential, even if you get progressive laws, even if you get good policymakers, if you do not have a vibrant civil society, you're not going to make progress.
I agree with that, and I think let me say that when I say and when I hear people saying that US immigration system is kind of other countries want to replicate, they also see that United States has been very lucky in the sense that we have this legacy of immigration, that most people can relate to immigration, that we've had several centuries or several decades of immigration, and we've experimented with bad policies as well. So the primary, it's not really immigration policy as such helps somewhat, but what is most impressive is our legacy of immigration. Another thing, English language. So a lot of people come here because English has become a universal language. Our universities. So a lot of immigrants come for that. But the other interesting thing about the United States is we don't have a single vision on immigration. So when you talk about civil society, you see that there are cities and states that want immigrants to be excluded, and then there are cities and states where, especially the places, the sanctuary cities, where especially the places where we've had a very high immigration from the past that are actually more inclusive, like the city I live in, New York City. This city goes beyond, what the federal government says. It goes beyond that. It tries to actually be as inclusive as possible. So we have throughout across this city, this country, every city and state has its own vision on immigration, and immigrants basically move to places where they find that they're more welcome. No? So yes, civil society is very important, and the legacy. We are very lucky that we have this legacy of immigration, that at this point of history when we have demographic problems, when all of Europe is facing demographic problems, they know that they need immigrants, and that partly is the reason why Angela Merkel, who a few years ago said that immigration, multiculturalism is dead, now she says that immigration is the most defining issue of her generation. And she's the one who talked about, I don't want to impose any limit on Syrian refugee influx. It's really the demographic and the economics. And we are very lucky, at least the places that are accepting immigrants, is that we have that environment where some places in this country that welcome immigrants, and the others that don't are having problems to integrate immigrants and to have a civil society that can integrate them or welcome them.
I just have a comment here. I want to wrap in your comment about the history of anti-Asian discrimination in the United States with this issue around civil society, and then I have a question for you, Minzao. I think the issue. So, for example, Italians, Irish were also discriminated against in jobs and housing. Some were also hung, right? And yet we have no problem today thinking about these populations as white and essentially sort of living what I would call sort of above the caste line, right? And so what's really interesting about this is that at the end of the 18th century, 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, there is language on the books that talks about Southeastern Europeans being essentially of a different race, right? And yet, in the case of Italians in particular, while they worked for La Raza, right, the Italian race, there were all these instruments of incorporation that invited them into whiteness. Okay? And so even though they worked to maintain their racialized national identities, there were all these incentives that brought them, incorporated them above the caste line into whiteness. And so here's a way in which a population which at one point in history maybe was considered to be racially different than American white, so to speak, but was ultimately incorporated in. And part of what I want to say about this sort of Asian American story in the United States is that while there are instances of severe anti-Asian discrimination, that doesn't preclude incorporation over the caste line, and essentially what I would argue sort of incorporation into whiteness. And so the point about civil society that I want to sort of bring back in, because you've noted your interest in that topic a couple times today. You know, part of the Asian American model minority myth, we talk a lot about the hard work part, right? But I'd be interested in your thinking on the other end of that, which is work hard and don't complain about race, right? Work hard and don't get involved in civil society. Work hard, become a highly technically competent professional, but don't try to manage what's going on here, right? So in many ways, if Asian Americans are as smart and wonderful as the model minority, certain conceptions of the model minority myth would have us believe, why isn't there an Asian American president, right? That is to say, I'm interested in your thinking about how the economic success of Asian Americans has been in some ways facilitated by the perception, at least, of a lack of interest in American civil society and American politics, or, if you will, power and governance in America.
Oh, just jump on this.
Yeah.
So, yes and kind of no.
Okay.
So that in the sense of, if you look at Bobby Jindal, you look at Nikki Haley, right? So they get read in southern states. So this isn't Massachusetts or some liberal white state. These are like deep South, long segregated slaveholding states, right? So something has happened in that kind of configuration that they get read not as white, but not as black, or not as other, as unacceptable other. And this is a long way from, and this is part of also within these communities. So there have been two cases that went to the Supreme Court in the history of the country, two cases over who is white in the country. One was someone of Japanese descent, and another was someone from South Asian. This was around the 1920s. Ian Haney Lopez wrote a book called White by Law.
That's right.
And he talks about how they went to court and they tried to say, you know, because of my skin color, I should be seen as white. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, but you're not from the white history areas of the world, so no.
Right.
And then you had somebody who was from those caucuses, they're like, yeah, but you don't look white. So, you know, it was basically a definition of convenience, but it was clearly that there is a clear line above the caste, above the race, that's there. So I would, you know, throw that in the mix because you still have some really interesting unfolding racial lines, and the 2020 census will be really interesting to see how people are marking those racial lines as, again, the census changes one more time.
I had a sense that you were gonna. I felt like you were going. You were about to.
No. I was just enjoying his comment. So I
mean-
agree with what you said. Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, Bobby Jindal and others are interesting, but I also think it's interesting that these are also Republicans, right? And so these are folks who are neatly attached to certain, the maintenance of they're not disrupting the white supremacist racial order in the United States, and I think are evidence of the incorporation over the caste line. So I take your point, if I'm reading it correctly, that there is civil society involvement, but to some extent that involvement has been in league with whites, right? So for example, one of the things that we don't talk about, I would say enough, are Asian American attitudes towards Latinos and blacks, right? I mean, they map onto and oftentimes exceed the kind of anti-brown and black attitudes of whites in the country. And so I think something about this, you know, being incorporated into whiteness could potentially be a thing, or maybe I'm just, you know, I need to have some more coffee.
So I have two comments on.
I think.
I'm sorry.
Is it working?
Yeah. very interesting question about becoming, right? Becoming white. So you're right about, taking a historical perspective is very important, because group formation is constantly shaped by historical circumstances. For Asian Americans, it used to be very severely discriminated against all the way through, and now they seem to be on their way to become white or model minority. So there was a question about Asian Americans becoming white. So if white suggests privileged socioeconomic status, in a way, they say, you may say yes, they are meeting, like converging to the socioeconomic status of white, but they are still not treated as white. For example, even when some of our policies, Asians, especially East and South Asians, are not part of the protected category, whereas Southeast Asians are because they are refugees, whereas the other Asians are more highly, the perception is they are more highly skilled. So they are not considered minority, but they are not considered white either. Italians and Irish, they used to be a separate, discriminated categories. And then after World War II, and then again, the civil rights movement, very important, then they have become white, especially the children and grandchildren of Irish and Italian Americans. They come of age in the 1950s and 60s, benefited from the African American struggle for equality, and they come out and then they claim their ethnic heritage as some sort of a symbolic ethnicity. And that symbolic ethnicity is not the same as like the identity of being Asian or being black. There is the negative connotation to that too, as well, of course, as the self-empowering ethnic identity. So becoming is an interesting empirical question for now. It depends on how you define whiteness, right? And then like 50 years down the road, Asians may become white. And then the color line between black and white may be blur or shift to non-white versus non-black versus black, or non-white versus white, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, Clarence.
So let me disturb this narrative a little more.
Yeah, disturb it. Let's get disturbed.
So Asians may or may not become white, but I will guarantee you within the Latino community, there will be whiteness. And in what the data is showing, there's a lot of data that shows by 2050 and 2040, the country will be majority, whatever. But if you look at how many people in the Latino community are checking those boxes, they're not going in that direction. And the overwhelming majority of Latinos, something like 70% or something like that, who check the race box, check white. Now, some of them are going to, no matter the phenotype, so some of them are going to, be able to make that cross, and they'll go Gerardo Rivera on us and become Gerald Rivers, and it's true, right? But then there are others who can't, right? So, and then there's, the Afro-Latino community who are not even kind of in that middle mix at all, right? So that's a growing sort of discourse as well in the Black community. So this becoming is really critical. And what happens is race doesn't end, it evolves. And another critical point here is when we talk about civil society, most of us sort of are talking about that in people who are progressive and trying to make great change and positive change and like that. But as you point out, civil society includes everybody. So it includes the far right, it includes these conservative organizations as well. And at any given point, that balance between the progressive side of civil society and the reactionary side of civil society, they're always in tension with each other. Sure. And so we have to take that into account as well, because we could see some really dramatic changes, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to come from the progressive side of civil society.
And then I'm just, great, yeah. Your name is Aaron, right? Yeah. Can we get a mic? I think it's for posterity, though. We need it.
Gee whiz. Although I wonder about the narrative of Latino integration into whiteness or assimilation into whiteness. I wonder if we might be able to, in the same way that obviously all Latino communities are not the same, if we might be able to specify and if that helps to understand how whiteness is a contingent and historical process of assimilation, right? So, I mean, does it matter, at least in some of the data that we're starting to see, the rates at which Cuban immigrant families versus Mexican versus like Guatemalan families are beginning to assimilate into a kind of a white identity, right? I mean, which is really just a question about the story of, Rafael Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, right? I mean, I think that matters for the kind of political culture that we're entering into, right? So I'm wondering if those kinds of specificities help us to think about the way, whiteness is a contingent historical question, right? I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, I actually just had a comment about the civil society and the Asian American remark. I think I may be defining civil society in a different way, but actually I do research on sort of the history of legal activism, and especially Chinese communities at the turn of the century had like immense like community or organizations that sort of led to a lot of their relative successes with the law. So I think it might be a little, I don't know, like too quick to say that there's not like a civil society presence for Asians. Yeah, that was my only remark.
So just a couple of things, and I think we'll have time for at least one more exchange after these things. So one thing, if you can't tell, part of my argument here is that race is not about the way you look. It's not about your skin color, hair texture, bone structure, right? I would argue that it's jointly about skin color, hair texture, bone structure, language, religion, and nationality. And I'll give you 2 points of American history, one historical, one contemporary, that I think make this point. Beginning with sort of the incorporation of Mexicans into the United States. During that period of time, there's a book called Racial Fault Lines by Tomas Almaguer. And part of what he shows in that book is that when we incorporated Upper Mexico, also known as California, into the United States, there were certain Mexicans that were legally classified as white, and certain ones that were legally classified at that time racially, according to the U.S. Census, sort of as Mexican, right? That was the term du jour. And what's interesting about this is these folks didn't look any different than each other. What the distinctions were about the romantic language of Spanish and Christianity. And that the impoverished Mexicans didn't have these kinds of practices. On the other hand, more recently, the United States Census has been conducting an investigation. I first became suspicious of this shortly after 9/11, when, as a dissertating graduate student focused on race and ethnicity, a invitation from the U.S. Census circulated through the networks, and people were being invited to do ethnographic dissertations of Arab American communities by the U.S. Census. That has now matured, and there is certainly a proposal by the census, it has been declined by the Congress, to parcel off folks who are current, today people who are born in, say, Syria or Egypt who come to the United States, they're white, right? And so the idea is to create a whole new racial category in the United States, Middle Eastern, North African. And my point here is that they haven't changed their look over the last decade, right? But they're being escorted, invited out of whiteness, if you will, right? And I would argue that's with various notions of, national origin and religion, maybe potentially language. I think if you look at the distinctions between, say, for example, Asian Americans and blacks, the ways in which the census marks their racial category is different. Sort of blacks is this one drop stuff, and Asian Americans is like country of origin, right? And so I think to imagine that Asians could potentially be incorporated into whiteness, the reason why we struggle with that is because we're obsessed with the fact that race is about the way you look. And it's not always that way, and even in contemporary society, it isn't that way, again, with the MENA category. In terms of the civil society stuff, it's really interesting. I think the point that I would sort of say is that we don't have a conception of Asian Americans pushing on the race tip. So when I talk about work hard, and I say the other end of that is not civil society more broadly. I said it is don't complain about race, right? And so I think to the extent that we haven't seen a large contingent of Asian Americans pushing the race question in what we might call progressive directions, is part of the reason why they're allowed to do so well. Now, what's interesting, even more recently at Harvard, they are again being kind of associated with what we might think about as a larger white supremacist project in the undoing of affirmative action, right? And so that might be a provocative thing to say here at the end, but that would be how I kind of think about civil society, is sort of specifically on the race question. Other comments, questions? Oh, yes, please do. Say two things. It's for posterity.
We're recording.
I just want to speak on the ideology comment because I feel like that's what we're hitting on, but we're not naming it, different ideologies that we're tapping into. And I think that's said for language and how language allows us to identify differently. For Latinos, with the U.S. Census, Hispanic was created. And when race was asked, now it's being added differently, but it said white, blacks, or natives. And when you try to check another box, most times people just tell you to check white. And that's from personal experience and even working in immigration in the past, because you have to check something. So this ideology of language, of just like checking a box, is already a buying into a system that benefits, right? Like whiteness, you benefit from it. It makes more sense to check white than black in this country if you want privilege.
You're saying I should just check white and it'll be fine.
Yeah. And literally that's what people tell people. Yeah, just check white. Or they check it for you when you work through immigration. So I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing this. And just asking the ideologies behind language and how it limits us. And even with the word mestizaje, that's indigenous and Spaniards, but it's an erasure of blackness. And it's something that needs to be questioned. But yeah. I guess that was a comment to your point. Sorry about that.
Okay, so is there an instance where, this is the last point. So is there an instance where it makes sense when you could check white and you don't? Yes. Okay, so if you look at the Native American population, there was a tremendous leap in the numbers from 2000 to 2010. And it wasn't because there was like a lot of babies being born or like that, but the benefits of being Native American accrued. And so you had a lot of people who basically had, Elizabeth Warren kind of level of, indigenous and, heritage, who went, I want that scholarship, or, and so people check. But every census from 1790 to 2010 has wrestled with these questions, because these are questions you cannot answer it with any permanence and with any non-contingency. And so this is going to kind of continue. But the idea of who constructs your race, right, is varied, whether it's individuals, whether it's group, or whether it's the state. And quite often, they're out of alignment. And then that's when you get into, a lot of the issues we're talking about in terms of identity.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.